Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the Opportunity Framework Project. I'm Tyrone Buckley, and I lead our Fair Housing Unit as the Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. The goal of today's webinar is to engage our stakeholders and solicit feedback and knowledge sharing on how the state of California can build out a more comprehensive framework for affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH as you'll hear it called today. While AFFH has been part of federal law for decades, it was codified into our state law in 2018. So it is relatively new. And over the last few years, HCD has taken significant steps to AFFH through both the funding programs we administer and our land use related programs. However, we know there is still much more work to be done. And today we are seeking your input on ways that HCD and other state agencies can continue to build out our statewide AFFH strategy. To start off today, I'll be giving a high-level overview of the history of AFFH and what HCD has done in recent years to affirmatively further fair housing in our programs. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Osterberg, who's been leading this effort, who will provide a summary of why we launched the Opportunity Framework Project and what opportunities there will be for stakeholders to provide feedback during the process. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch after today's meeting. Next slide, please. So first, let's discuss our historical context. At HCD, we see our work as furthering the legacy of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which originally charged the government with not just prohibiting discrimination in housing, but also affirmatively furthering fair housing. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was the last major legislative victory of the civil rights movement. The bill languished in Congress for years, but when MLK, Martin Luther King, was assassinated, the bill was rushed through Congress, and a week later it was law. The AFFH obligation included two separate provisions in the law that require the federal government to affirmatively further fair housing. The first provision requires HUD to administer its programs and activities related to housing and urban development in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. And the second provision extends that obligation to other departments, federal departments, and agencies. The AFFH mandate was intended to charge the government with promoting integrated and balanced living patterns. However, the 1968 law did not actually define what it meant to AFFH. That was instead left up to the courts for the next 50 years after its passage. Next slide, please. In 2015, almost 50 years after the Fair Housing Act became law, HUD finally released a rule that defined what it meant to AFFH. And then in 2018, California passed AB 686, which codified into state law the definitions of AFFH that HUD included in 2015. AB 686 also established a mandate for all public agencies in California to AFFH, thereby expanding the mandate beyond federal agencies and grantees from the 1968 Civil Rights Act. And the obligation to AFFH under AB 686 exists no matter what happens at the federal level. So some of you might be aware that HUD ended the federal AFFH rule in 2020 and is now proposing a revised AFFH rule in 2023. But our obligation to AFFH in California remains constant due to AB 686. So what does it mean to AFFH? The AFFH definition in AB 686 incorporates both a focus on expanding access to high resource neighborhoods, as well as expanding opportunity in historically disinvested areas. Specifically, the AFFH definition requires the government to take meaningful actions to address disparities in opportunity access, address disparities in housing needs, work to replace segregated living patterns, transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and foster compliance with fair housing laws. Next slide, please. It should be noted that despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act and related civil rights laws, the political will has been slow to materialize and sustain the efforts to meaningfully reduce residential segregation and mitigate its negative effects. In fact, a recent study from the UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute found that racial segregation has remained high and has even increased in many metro areas in California since 1990, which has further entrenched racial and ethnic inequities and access to neighborhood level resources and opportunity. The enduring nature of segregation has led many people to consider it as a natural condition, as you see here in the quote from US Senator Edward Brooke, 1968. Next slide, please. However, in the last 10 years, there have been a number of developments that have increased the focus on the AFFH mandate, especially in California. As I already mentioned, in 2015, HUD released its federal AFFH rule. In 2018, California codified that mandate in the state law. And also in 2015, the Supreme Court case DHCD versus Inclusive Communities Project also affirmed disparate impact, thereby creating new legal mandates to address residential segregation and disparities in access to opportunity. In addition, more evidence has emerged in recent years on the harms of residential segregation and limited access to opportunity. This research has demonstrated that improving neighborhood environments, particularly during childhood, can end cycles of poverty, reduce racial inequity, and increase quality of life. At the same time, new evidence on location preferences has demonstrated that high levels of segregation persist largely due to barriers in housing choice, rather than the preferences of people of color. And lastly, research over the last decade has on the distribution of the state's affordable housing portfolio has demonstrated that this housing is overly concentrated in segregated areas and underrepresented in high resource areas, which has a big impact on the housing choices available to families, given that market rate housing in high resource areas also tends to be very expensive. Next slide, please. And you see a bit of that here on this chart. This chart shows the distribution of the low-income housing tax credit portfolio, or LIHTC portfolio, as of 2022. As you can see on this chart, while only 7% of neighborhoods in California have high levels of segregation and poverty, 24% of LIHTC homes and family-serving developments are located in these neighborhoods. On the other hand, while 40% of neighborhoods are designated as high or highest resource, only 18% of homes are located in these neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So in response to this information, in 2017, the state of California embarked on an effort to reduce racial segregation in California by incentivizing more affordable housing development in opportunity-rich neighborhoods. In order to achieve this goal, TCAC, the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, and HCD convened a group of independent researchers and advocates, known then as the Fair Housing Task Force, to create a map ensuring opportunity across California that could be used to guide investment in affordable housing projects and rebalance our portfolio. The goal of the map is to identify areas in every region of the state whose characteristics have been shown by research to support positive outcomes for low-income families, particularly with children. The map looks at indicators in 3 areas: education, economics, and environment. So for instance, the map looks at things like what percentage of adults in the census tract are employed, what percentage of students graduate on time, what pollutants are present in the environment, among other indicators. Depending on how census tracts perform against each other on these indicators relative to other tracts in their region, they are categorized on a scale of low resource to highest resource. And then there's also a high segregation and poverty category that captures any census tracts where people of color are overrepresented and at least 30% of the population is below the federal poverty line. Next slide, please. The map was originally designed to be incorporated into the 9% LIHTC program administered by TCAC. But in 2018, the TCAC regulations were changed to provide a basis boost and site amenity points to projects in high or highest resource areas. Then in 2019, TCAC added a tiebreaker incentive for projects in these areas. You can see from the chart on this slide that the incorporation of the map into the 9% LIHTC program has resulted in a modest increase to the number of units funded in higher resource areas. For instance, while only 13% were located in high or highest resource neighborhoods between 2015 and 2018, in the years following, the percentage of units in these neighborhoods increased to 22%. Although given that 40% of tracts overall are located in these neighborhoods, affordable housing projects are still underrepresented in these high resource areas. More recently, the map has been incorporated into several other affordable housing programs in California, including the 4% LIHTC program and HCD Supernova. Next slide, please. In addition to the work that HCD has done to promote AFFH when funding affordable housing projects, HCD has also taken steps to promote AFFH in the land use and planning process. So for instance, in response to AB 686, HCD released an AFFH guidance memo that provides guidance to jurisdictions on how to AFFH in the housing element. HCD also released the AFFH data viewer around the same time, which compiles dozens of layers of fair housing related data that jurisdictions can use when analyzing fair housing issues in the housing. In response to AB 1771, which passed in 2018, HCD has started providing technical assistance to regions to help them affirmatively further housing when allocating RHNA to local jurisdictions. HCD also developed the Pro Housing Designation Program that recognizes cities that, among other things, take meaningful actions towards AFFH. Cities that receive Pro Housing Designation get priority for certain funding programs. And then lastly, as another example, we also designed the REAP 2.0 program, which provides funding for planning and implementation activities, so that now includes a strong emphasis on AFFH. So in summary, HCD has worked to launch a number of different programs and policies over the last few years to AFFH, both in our funding programs and in the land use context. But we recognize there's still more work to be done, and that's what the Opportunity Framework is all about. So that's it for our brief overview of AFFH history and HCD actions to meet our AFFH mandate. Next, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague and the person running the Opportunity Framework Project, Annalisa Osterberg, to discuss the Opportunity Framework Project. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyrone. So next I'm going to discuss why we decided to launch the Opportunity Framework Project. As Tyrone laid out, there's been increased focus on the need to AFFH in California since 2015. And the first major effort that the state embarked on was the development of the TCAC HCD Opportunity Map, which is intended to increase access to high resource neighborhoods and improve housing choice. But we recognize that there's more that the state could be doing to build out a comprehensive plan to advance all of the AFFH objectives outlined in statute. So for instance, the TCAC HCD Opportunity Map was designed to advance just 2 of the state's AFFH goals, addressing disparities in opportunity access and fostering integration. However, we don't have as many programs or tools that we can use to promote the other AFFH objectives. And so this is why we launched the Opportunity Framework Project last year, to develop a more comprehensive approach to affirmatively furthering fair housing that can simultaneously further each of the AFFH objectives. Through the Opportunity Framework Project, HCD is working to build out a more comprehensive framework for how the state can AFFH. And specifically, we want it to lay out a couple of things. One is what it means to AFFH in different neighborhoods, including the role that mobility strategies play and the role of place-based strategies. Second is how the state can AFFH across different policy contexts, including what can be done through the state's funding programs versus through land use policy. And the third is how the state can measure and evaluate its progress moving forward. In order to build out the policy framework, we're also thinking through the following questions, including how existing AFFH policies can be refined, what new policies or programs are needed, and what additional tools are needed to support this work beyond the TCAC HCD Opportunity Map. And while we will obviously be taking a close look at HCD's programs and how they can be further built out or expanded, the goal of the project is to think more comprehensively about how all of the state level programs fit together and what HCD could be doing to better collaborate with other state entities to meet our AFFH objectives. And so the project will not solely be focused on HCD's programs. Again, the goal of the project is to come up with a policy framework that allows the state to simultaneously make progress advancing each of the areas reflected in the AFFH definition. And so to build out this framework, we've been engaged in a few activities. First, we've been working to conduct a landscape analysis to outline the current AFFH related policies and programs that state agencies are using to AFFH in California. Second, we will be providing stakeholders a number of opportunities to provide feedback on how the state should AFFH. And then third, we've been partnering with academic and policy experts to review the existing literature on AFFH, community development, and other related topics. So for instance, last year, our research partners helped us dig into the literature on 3 topics related to identifying good locations for making place-based investments. The 3 types of neighborhoods we were focused on were areas where community revitalization is needed, areas where gentrification is causing displacement, and areas with cultural amenities, such as ethnic enclaves. For each of these neighborhood types, we looked into what the outcomes are of people who live in these areas, whether building or preserving housing in these areas furthers the AFFH goals, and where these types of neighborhoods are located. And so the findings from this research, as well as what we hear from stakeholders, will then be used to inform the final policy framework that we will develop at the end of the project. In terms of the specific opportunities there will be for stakeholders to provide feedback, after today's webinar, we will be sending out a link to a public survey where you can share your ideas and suggestions for how the state can AFFH. The survey will be up for 1 month through July 7th. After the survey closes, HCD will summarize and analyze the results, which could inform what topics we conduct additional research on, as well as the content of the final policy framework. Ultimately, so you can get a sense of what the policy framework will be used for, we expect the findings and recommendations that come out of this project to influence the design of HCD's future funding program guidelines, including next year's Supernova, as well as HCD's next round of updates to its land use programs. Later in the year, we will also be organizing a series of stakeholder engagement, series of smaller focus groups with experts on AFFH, community development, gentrification, and other topics. The goals of these meetings will be to create a space for dialogue, to brainstorm new ideas for how the state can further build out its AFFH approach in these areas. And then lastly, we also have a dedicated email inbox where stakeholders can send feedback, as well as any questions regarding the Opportunity Framework project. And there will also be information posted to HC's AFFH webpage over the next few months. So next, I'm going to give a high-level summary of some of the questions in the survey that we're hoping to get your feedback on. The first set of questions ask respondents to suggest one thing that HCD could do to better further each of the different aspects of the AFFH mandate. So for these questions, we recognize that it's really important for the state to continue to build out a range of policies that collectively further all of the goals embedded in the AFFH mandate. So we're inviting stakeholders to think about each goal separately to make sure that we receive policy suggestions that relate to each of the different aspects of the AFFH mandate. These questions are also based on the idea that there are many different policies the state could theoretically pursue to AFFH. So as we build out our approach, we want to make sure that we prioritize the policies or programs that would have the biggest impact. So when we think about what gaps exist in the state's current AFFH approach, or what refinements are needed to existing programs, we want to first focus on those that will do the most to improve AFFH outcomes. And when answering these questions, we also invite stakeholders to think about the full range of policies that HCD works on. So both what HCD could do through its range of funding programs, as well as through our land use programs. Next, there are a series of questions that seek feedback on what HCD could do to better support the revitalization of historically disinvested communities. We recognize that as a state, we have put more emphasis on expanding access to high resource areas than we have on the revitalization of disinvested areas. And that's in part because we don't have as much information about what works when it comes to community revitalization. And so for these questions, we're hoping to get stakeholder input on both what effective community revitalization looks like and also what the state can do to best support these efforts. We also have a few questions that are aimed at gathering ideas for how HCD could AFFH through collaboration with other state agencies? These questions are based on the idea that the AFFH mandate requires that all public agencies AFFH. The mandate does not just apply to HCD, it applies to any other state agency that does work related to community development, which could include work on transportation, health, or education, among other issue areas. And we recognize that the public agency mandate is really important because often true community revitalization requires work across these different silos. And so at HCD, we see part of our role as an educator because we can make sure that our other peer agencies at the state understand the AFFH mandate, and we can work together with these other agencies to create programs or partnerships that take a cross-sector approach to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So for these questions, we're seeking stakeholder input on what state entities you think HCD should focus on collaborating with, or if you have any ideas for specific cross-agency programs or partnerships that you think would be particularly impactful. We also have a few questions that are focused on soliciting input on what a balanced approach to affirmatively furthering fair housing looks like. These questions are based on the idea that to AFFH effectively, it's necessary to take a both-and approach, to both focus on expanding access to high opportunity areas and also focus on revitalizing disinvested communities. But in practice, it can be challenging to figure out what the right balance is, what it actually looks like to take a balanced approach. And so we have a few questions that solicit stakeholder ideas on this topic. The next question that we have is around what additional tools may be needed to better support AFFH efforts in California. So as you're filling out the survey, if there's any time that you identify a new program or approach that you think HCD or other public agencies should take, but you realize we don't have the tools necessary to implement this work right now, then we encourage you to flag for us what those tools are. And then the last question is about metrics. So specifically, we asked what metrics the state should use to track its progress towards affirmatively furthering fair housing, so that we can over time look back and see whether or not the efforts that we are pursuing have been effective. So then just one final note on the survey. It contains about a dozen open-ended questions that cover a wide range of topics. We don't expect stakeholders to have suggestions in every single topic area. So if you want to skip around in the survey and focus on answering the questions that you interact most directly with in your work, that's totally fine. All the questions in the survey are optional. But that wraps up the content that we hope to share with you all today. We hope it's been helpful and answered some questions about how to provide input as HCD strives to build out a more comprehensive framework for how the state can AFFH. We are eager to start hearing from you over the next couple of months through the survey and other venues for input. So we encourage you to keep an eye out for the email that will be sent out soon with a link to the survey. And the recording of today's webinar will be posted to our HC website in the next week or so if you would like to refer back to it. And if there are any questions, we invite you to reach out through our inbox listed on the screen. But thank you again, and we look forward to hearing your ideas for how the state can AFFH.